Welcome to the Dissident Mama podcast. Today, my guests are Conrad Franz and Dmitriy Kalyagin, co-hosts of the preeminent geopolitical podcast World War Now. The weekly show tackles current events by looking at their metaphysical implications and symbolism, and digs into political religious realignment through a postmodern Orthodox Christian lens, and from the perspective of saintly Christian prophecy and rising multipolarity. Franz is a member of the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese of North America, and Kalyagin is a member of ROKOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Welcome, gentlemen.
Pleasure to be here.
Great to be here. It's an honor, really, after so long watching your content and seeing you around on social media and finally being invited on as a guest. I think it's a little bit smitten by the event, but yeah, let's talk. It's a pleasure.
Well, one of the reasons I like your show and the people I know who like your show is you do a lot of third rail topics. I think y'all have called them unique paradigms, Christianity commingling with current events. So we're going to get into that. But before that, introduce yourselves a little bit beyond what I have already said, and then maybe explain to people how your show works, because some things are behind a paywall, some things can be read, sometimes y'all are interviewing people. Kind of give people the lowdown of that, and also tell us about your 50th episode, which I think is forthcoming.
Yeah, well, I'll introduce myself. I'll give Dmitry a brief chance and then just give some of his background, and then I'll explain the show, I guess. And my name's Conrad Franz. I'm a convert to Orthodox Christianity. I've been Orthodox for about 4 years now. And I am a journalist. I write articles for turleytalks.com. That's, I guess, my day job. And I do stuff for him. And then about a year ago, we started World War Now, and I hit up Dmitry. We're mutual friends with David Erhan and some other Orthodox creators, and had been in mutual circles online. So that's how we got connected. But yeah, I went to college in New York City. That was kind of where I got more exposed to Orthodoxy. I think living in such a cosmopolitan setting helped to accelerate my, I was always a conservative right-wing person, but with the whole Trump thing, I became more reactionary, and living in New York, I think, accelerated that for me. But I live in Texas, in good old capital of Austin, Portland in the South, as they say, but I still think it's a nice city. But yeah, we started World War Now a year ago, and like you said, our 50th episode coming up, and that's a Q&A, but I'll let Dmitry introduce himself, then we'll explain kind of what that's all gonna lead to.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I haven't had the privilege, unfortunately, of undergoing a formal catechism like most people who've converted to the faith. So I had the experience of essentially growing up in the church, and fortunately, my parents were also of an Orthodox background. So I had that 20+ year growth of essentially an informal catechism, you could say. Attending church, the priest kind of teaching me, but there's also a lot of pitfalls along the way, which. I didn't grow up in a majority Orthodox country, so there was a lot of challenges as in growing up through perhaps teenagehood and sort of realigning my ideas of what I learned, say, in church on Sundays with what I learned, for example, 5 days a week in school. So it was a major challenge, and I think probably brought around a lot of growth for me personally. But essentially, one of my big transformational points was around 16, 17 when I became a catechism teacher. So my priest blessed me to teach catechism at my local Orthodox school. And so that, I did that for about 4 to 5 years, and that brought around some decent development in terms of my personal understanding of scripture. I had to read a bunch of stuff in order to, produce a really coherent curriculum. I was reading a bunch of catechism materials from saints and again, the actual study was in both Russian and English. So I had to essentially, perfect my translating skills in that capacity as well. But ended up teaching a lot of actually teenage kids, not much older than myself, really, and even kids as young as 7, 8 years old. So I had that skill, I guess, picked up of actually speaking about Orthodoxy to an audience. And once COVID hit, that really hit my mind really strongly, because the kids couldn't come to catechism school anymore. And suddenly in my mind, I had this urgency pick up. And this is when I became involved with, say, Conrad, David, people like Jay Dyer, for example, the online Orthodox community very heavily, because I understood, look, these governments can simply shut us down, not allow us to go to school in certain states, in certain countries. And suddenly it's And we used to take things like, Orthodox catechism school for granted because we were like,
Yep.
oh, it's going to church, things like that. So that was when I guess when I was radicalized, so to speak, in terms of, okay, I need to create a Twitter account. I need to actually, my voice needs to be somewhere else, out, not just in my local community, so to speak. But I did have that privilege of growing up in a very Orthodox family. Some of my family members are clergy. Some were in monasticism as well. I had a great aunt who was an abbess at one of the Jerusalem monasteries in the late 80s and 90s. So I did have that experience of, like, I guess you could say, filtration, where if I ever did anything really cringe or ridiculous in my life, maybe in my youth, I could always be like, okay, what would like a great aunt say, or what would like these people, my grandmother say, or my grandfather or great uncle? And it kind of kept me away from trouble growing up. And I think it's paid off long term, but we'll see. I mean, again, we're only humans, so I'm always stumbling, but nevertheless, we're here with Conrad now, and we're, of course, producing, I think, what profession-wise, what suits us the most. Conrad is a professional journalist. I'm more of a historian, I would say, more of an academic. So he's definitely the really well-spoken and I would just say eloquent fellow who can actually give out his Orthodox opinion and on geopolitical news very very adequately to a modern audience, which I think is really important. So, and in many ways, I can say it's a semi-missionary activity. So, I think it all goes a long way. It's all a big combination, and some people may find it a bit confronting, but for others, I really think it's comforting, and we've been getting a lot of good feedback. So, here we are.
Yes, go ahead, Conrad.
I was going to say it was almost a little over a year ago now we started the show, and I guess the event that caused us to start the show was when the Nord Stream pipelines got blown up, and then Putin signed Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, declared them as parts of Russia. And basically, I guess I realized that we're in the Third World War, and I guess the person we kind of cite on that the most would be Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu, who talks a lot about his experiences with St. Paisios, St. Porphyrios, St. Iakovos, these saints of our latter days here from Greece. And I hit up Dmitry. I saw that he had an account that was covering kind of the situation in Russia and Ukraine specifically, and from a very Orthodox perspective. I knew him from the JDire Discord server and whatnot, so I was like, all right, I think, what if we started a show? And I started this Twitter thread. You can go to my Twitter account. It's still on my like highlights, that I kind of outlined this huge thread explaining what I thought was going on. And turns out I was totally right. And and here we are. And that's, I think, why not to say that I didn't think that the podcast would do well. I thought that we were kind of starting a show that not anyone else was really doing, in the sense of, like, I guess, taking a little bit of a leap and being like, no, like, I think what they talked about and what these prophets and what these saints talked about is like actually happening. I just thought it was so obvious that someone should kind of start making that connection, and on, I guess, a weekly basis start talking about it. And then, like Dmitry said, he's a historian, and so we also have, those that aren't aware, we have Ether Hour, which is we try to do weekly, at the very least 3 times a month, if not 4 times a month, as well as the free regular show. We have just kind of a variety show, I guess. We talk about history, we talk about saints that haven't been canonized yet, we talk about political ideas that we find interesting, we interview people. We also have interviews on the main show, so it kind of just depends on what we're feeling when we bring a guest on. If they're more of a perennial guest or somebody, we bring Jim Jatras on and we just want to get his take on what's going on right now. But then we bring someone like Abbot Trifon on, we're going to get his wisdom, and we're going to hear his retelling of the life and times of Blessed Dmitry of Santa Rosa, which is one of our recent episodes. So that's kind of, I guess, I try to inhabit like you said, a postmodern kind of, whimsical kind of look at the world, but also, I'll just say, kind of hard right geopolitics as well.
And you've used a couple of words like combination and I think connection. Those are things that y'all do well, because I'm kind of a big picture person. To me, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, drag queen story hour, climate change hysteria, to melting down the Robert E. Lee statue from Charlottesville, like, it's all the same thing. I see it as an attack on the truth, what is good and beautiful, mostly history, heritage, tradition, and overall our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So y'all use the term civilizational sometimes. So I want y'all to connect some of these dots. But first, before we get to that, I think some terms need to be defined. Would that be okay if I ask y'all to define a couple words?
Sure.
Okay. Multipolarity. Give people a feel for what that means.
I'll let Dmitry start on that one. Yeah.
Well, I guess how I would approach it would be simply multipolarity is the opposite of unipolarity. And these are terms coined by, I believe, mostly not historians, but mostly political scientists prior to Alexander Dugin. But for myself, he popularized the term. That's the first time I really heard it, and the first time I read about it in Foundations of Geopolitics. And Alexander Dugin, he's a sociologist, expert of geopolitics. I mean, he coined the term geopolitics in the Russian language, and he's even a conspiracy theorist from Russia. But naturally, now he's become a bit more popular in the English sphere. But Alexander Dugin essentially speaks of multipolarity as a world, if you can imagine it on a world map, as the world would have been in perhaps the 19th century, when there was certain poles of power around the world, and it wasn't really split into the model we see post 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was, well, when I suppose most of us who are just say under 30 remember the world as it is post 1991, where it was America is the great superpower, the Soviet Union is gone. Sort of this bipolarity is no longer there. There's no more balance of powers in the world. It's essentially the American way of life, the American culture. It dominates American politics. We saw that in Yugoslavia, in the Middle East. It essentially is quite hegemonic, and essentially, kind of it enforces a certain order around the world. Multipolarity is the opposite of that. It's moving towards perhaps the system we saw in the 19th century. And for for those interested, that's probably what we saw prior to World War I, where you had certain powers around the world still very European and Eurocentric: the Ottoman Empire, Germany, France, I guess the late French Empire, the late British Empire, and of course the Russian Empire spanning across all of Asia, and the rising Asian countries, India still being a colony, China again in this very critical state, and of course the rising Japan. So a world where one country and one civilization doesn't necessarily dictate culture on a global scale to everybody else. Now, for us Orthodox Christians, this is slightly challenging, only because it may seem like, wow, maybe Orthodox culture should dominate around the world. Maybe we should be, these American unipolar, imperialist types. But we actually see the opposite throughout history. Even a country like the Byzantine Empire, they saw themselves as the center. And I don't want to get too off tangent, but they saw themselves as the center of the world, but they never imposed in terms of world domination. Their culture was, of course, very powerful and very influential, but they never sought to conquer the outside world to a large extent. They kind of just saw themselves as influencing other places around them, in particular Russia, Persia, for example, even the Arabs to whom they sent different missionaries. But they sent missionaries around the world in order to try and bring people to Christ. And I think that's possible in a multipolar setting, as it is in a unipolar setting. But in multipolar settings, it's very interesting because you can send missionaries to various civilizational points from, say, America or Russia, and you can have entire, I guess, in a multipolar setting, entire poles convert to Christianity. But this is how Christianity comes into that whole multipolar question. I kind of expanded on the initial question, but that's where I would say it isn't necessarily just the geopolitical term. I think in an Orthodox setting, it can be kind of commented on as well. But hopefully that answers your question. So it isn't unipolarity, which we see now, but I think it's something. It's a certain reality civilizationally that we are moving towards.
And I would just add briefly, if I could, he basically summed it all up, just that, it's just the destruction of the post-war order, and I see that not just as much in the, obviously, most obviously and clearly the geopolitical situation, Ukraine being, kind of a correction of the Cold War, which itself was a, obvious reaction to the reality after the fall of Nazi Germany and everything in World War II. But as far as the kind of narratives around that, that's also just the entire ethos of society is very much finally moving beyond that 80-year period. We're hearing that now with Israel, that everyone in Israel is afraid that their country won't make it longer than 80 years because that's how long Jewish states tend to last. But at the same token, I mean, more normies talk about the fourth turning and all of this kind of stuff. But in general, I don't think we had seen the world had never seen such a hegemonic order, both governmentally, militarily, as the United States, but I guess I mean, I like to say that an alchemical transmutation of the world mind was like put onto people, and everybody was convinced of a bunch of nonsense, like egalitarianism, worship of democracy and this stuff. But the multipolar world, ultimately, as Dmitry said, as these other civilizations rise up, those civilizations will have a fundamentally different ethos than the globalized post-war ethos, and that will allow for alternative forms of government. And then, like Dmitry said, hopefully in some of these places, a openness to evangelism towards orthodoxy. As I mean, this maybe I don't want to expand too much, but this ultimately does tie into ideas of Moscow and Russia as the third Rome, and that relates to what Dmitry was saying about the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah. Let's circle back in a second, because I had some questions about the multipolarity. But third Rome, define that for people. A lot of American Christians haven't really heard about that before. You hear it in Orthodox circles, but can you explain what that is?
Well, I think the third Rome is the idea that, going back to the Second Thessalonians, Apostle Paul's message, Second Thessalonians chapter 2, I believe, verse 6 to 8, Apostle Paul speaks about the idea that the Antichrist will not arrive, God will not permit him to be born and to rule on earth until the Roman Empire falls. And so where we get that commentary from in particular is the author of our liturgy, which is used in 90% of churches, 90% of services, St. John Chrysostom. He interprets. And of course, his commentary on Apostle Paul is considered very powerful, very sort of dominant, I think. They say that, what the other saints say about St. John Chrysostom, they say his words are Paul's words and Paul's words are Christ's words. So essentially, St. John Chrysostom's commentary is very, very accurate and usually to the point. But he essentially says that Apostle Paul speaks about the Roman Empire as withholding the reign of the Antichrist. So essentially what we call the New World Order in, layman's terms these days. And the Roman Empire as a spiritual idea, it obviously Christ was born during the reign of Augustus, so the Roman Empire had some importance in the life of Christians. Not expanding too much upon that, of course, Constantine baptized the entire empire, and naturally, the empire continued on until 1453 when it fell to the Ottoman Turks in one way or another. With struggles that continued on. Naturally, of course, succession was brought over to the nearest Orthodox civilization at the time in 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. The only Orthodox country at the time which was independent and which had an Orthodox monarch who actually reigned with essentially a large cohort of bishops, a large cohort of clergymen, was Moscow, right, under Basil II. And so Basil II's son, Basil I's son, Ivan III, proclaims himself as a Tsar, an autocrat, in a similar fashion to the Byzantine emperors. He even marries a Byzantine princess to kind of solidify the idea that, look, I'm a successor spiritually. And of course, some monks in Russia at the time, some of which are canonized and some are not, begin speaking of Russia, because of course they're all viewing this, unlike today when we view, say, Nasrallah or the events in Israel occur kind of in real time on our telephones. Back then they heard about Constantinople falling and they said, well, how does this relate to, I guess, eschatologically? Well, is this the end of the world? A lot of people thought, yes, it was, actually, because they thought, well, all right, we're here, that's okay, we're all waiting for Christ anyway. But suddenly they said, look, there's still this massive Orthodox country in the north here, and it seems to be that it not only is it rising, but it's also prospering, and there's a lot of monasteries being set up. There's great saints. Saint Sergius of Radonezh was still around. You had just an amazing Orthodox community flourishing. And so this idea of Third Rome kind of arises in Russia at the time, and it's cemented by the culture of the day over there. And they also see themselves, the Russian people see themselves as successors. And not just that, but the actual Greek Orthodox communities and those Antiochian, Arabic, Palestinian Orthodox communities in the Middle East under the Turkish yoke also see Russia in the north. And even the Serbians, once the Serbians are also conquered by the Ottoman Turks, they also see Russia in the north as this successor. And they send letters up north, and they say, throughout the 1400s, 1500s, and they say, look, you're the new Orthodox Tsar. You're anointed in a similar fashion to the throne. You guys are the Third Rome, the successor, and the prophecy of Apostle Paul and the prophecy of Saint John Chrysostom, his commentary on it, it's still in play. So the Roman Empire still exists in a spiritual way. And of course, some people can say, well, it's not physically Roman. I mean, geographically, it's somewhere up north. How does that relate? Well, in fact, in the Orthodox Church, not all concepts need a certain, I would say, physical material placeholding. For example, the Greeks should understand this a bit more than, there's a patriarch of Antioch, but Antioch physically does not exist today, right? Or Patriarch Bartholomew, he calls himself Patriarch of Constantinople, but Constantinople is more of an archaeological ruin than even Alexandria in Egypt or Cairo. Like, there's nothing left of that Constantinople that we remember, yet he still calls himself Patriarch, not Patriarch of Istanbul. He calls himself a Patriarch of a city which is gone, right? It's almost completely decimated. The Hagia Sophia stands, but it's desecrated, and there's barely any walls left. It's just an archaeological dig, if anything. Or, I mean, the Patriarch of Antioch is a great example. The Patriarch of Sinope in Turkey, all these cities which there are bishops of, and I'm just speaking from an Orthodox perspective strictly here. There are cities where bishops, they claim that they are bishops of those cities and those communities, but those communities themselves don't actually exist in real time, and the bishop lives elsewhere. Like, I believe the Bishop of Sinope, the Greek Bishop of Sinope, lives in Australia. So it's like, but Sinope doesn't exist. It's like a fictitious. It's like in a history book. It's a chapter, and I'm not saying that's bad. That's simply how Orthodox communities transferred this tradition of always having a bishop of this ancient place, and in the same way, Russia spiritually inherited this tradition. And I would say this is also exemplified by the fact that Russia was blessed enough to have a community which produced so many saints and such interesting Orthodox literature. Like, I would say very positive. It had a very positive impact. So I would say by their fruits, you would know them. That's on one hand. And also just by the testimony of Orthodox Christian elders, bishops, like, I mean, your American bishop, on one hand, St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, probably the greatest miracle worker of America, I would say, in terms of actually, like, people praying to him, is probably one of the most popular saints in America. He in the 1960s and 50s called Russia the Third Rome, which is he's probably the newest saint in the last 50, 60 years who actually explicitly called Russia not just Holy Rus, which, maybe is a more church term, but Third Rome specifically. So if St. John believed it, and St. John, he wasn't a dumb fellow. He was a seminary professor. He was asked to write historical articles back in the day before he was a bishop. He's an academic as well. In fact, he even wrote an entire book, like a short book on Russian monarchy and succession law throughout Russian history, which is like a really difficult PhD type book. But frankly, so St. John was a very smart guy, and he ends up calling Russia that during his sermons multiple times. So I think that's kind of what leads us to carry this idea on. It's not just, as people claim, it's not just playing pretend, it's a reality, right? And St. John wasn't pretending when he used to say that term. And I think Third Rome, Russia still needs to rise to that occasion naturally, because of course Russia is in this, it's in this, I don't know, kind of a Lord of the Ringsian type situation where there is no king in Gondor. There's a temporary placeholder, President Putin. There have been many other placeholders such as Brezhnev, Yeltsin, etc. going back, right? Some of them good, some of them pretty horrible, but nevertheless, it's in a very stagnant position at the moment. And perhaps in the future, the fullness of the Orthodox Empire will be restored. But until then, it still remains Third Rome at least. But even the Byzantine Empire had these periods, for example, the iconoclasm or the exile in Nicaea for 60 years, when technically the empire had these issues, and it was still considered an Orthodox empire, just under temporary, it was put on hold for reasons of politics and worldly affairs. But sorry for that very long-winded answer, but it's just me and Conrad. It's a great question, because me and Conrad, even though we love speaking about the subject, nobody ever asks us, or even, I mean, we never had the chance to even speak about this idea, because I think it's so powerful, especially now that we hear bishops call, like the Bishop of St. Petersburg 2 weeks ago called Moscow the Third Rome. I mean, this is the second most important bishop in all of Russia. Like, so it's not just a weird internet thing. It's like, if bishops are saying it in their speeches and sermons, I mean, that must be relevant, right?
Absolutely. And Conrad, tell us your thoughts on it. And go ahead. I was gonna do a follow-up, but I'll follow up after you're done.
Again, Dmitry, you're stealing all my thunder here. But no, like it's true, and this idea was important to us because we like we talked about before with multipolarity, we're describing this all as civilizational. What we mean by that is that, I guess, sort of as a Christian in general, and specifically, of course, becoming Orthodox, but we believe Orthodoxy, just, the truest form of Christianity is, and again, of course, the most important thing about Christianity is, of course, your participation in the sacraments of the church, your relationship with Christ, and your, with the saints and everything like that. But part of the Christian inheritance is an entire civilization. People, I think, forget that. And that's, I think, part of the joy of the saints in general, is you kind of feel like you're getting way more connected with the characters in scripture and the characters in the early church, because, we have apostolic succession. Our saints, laid hands on people that then laid hands on the people that we now see at our hierarchical divine liturgies that ordained the priests that we go to confession to and everything. And it's I think some people don't realize the breadth and the depth and the glory of the inheritance, even in a, frankly, even earthly sense. And I know that sounds, I'm not saying this in a utopian way, but I'm saying, even just from a basic historical perspective, I think people need to become civilizational in their thinking of how they consider their faith. Like, you shouldn't just dismiss when you hear a story from a Christian source in history. Like, I mean, this is, of course, a problem you see in the Protestant West and everything, where, I grew up Protestant. I went to a Protestant university, but we learned about history and everything. And you see all the people you go to a museum, we went to the cloisters, in New York City, and you hear our teacher explaining that in the Catholic and Orthodox tradition, for example, we believe that Joseph was an old man and he was betrothed, all this stuff. And all the people are like, that's silly, that's far-fetched. They just think they just think the fact that it just immediately kind of sounds strange to their modern sensibilities. Therefore, that was a made-up church tradition that silly medieval people would believe. But it's like, do you think Muslims in other countries, when they hear Muslim history, are immediately like, oh, that's stupid nonsense that no one really believes? No, because they have a civilizational perspective on their faith. That's why the situation in Israel is going on right now, because whether it's Erdogan in Turkey or the Shahs and not the Shahs, the mullahs in Iran, they view themselves as the fulfillment of the caliphate, and now they're able to organize against their perceived enemies, which are the Zionists. And finally, what we're seeing since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war was what looked like a glimmer of Christian civilization having organized and reassessed itself enough from the cesspool that was the 20th century, and now is able to fight back against, you could call it globalism, you can call it Zog, you can call it global homo, whatever it is, being manifested in Ukraine, the EU, NATO empire. And now that that's happening, I hope that more and more Christians can be even easier for them to adopt this civilizational perspective, which also immunizes you against the worldview of the modern world that tries to, the brain worm that tries to get everybody.
Yeah, and it's such a hard thing for Westerners, especially Americans, I think, to shake that mindset. And it's one of the things I think that freaks some people out about Orthodoxy is that, Christ is the King of Kings, right? So it kind of becomes this self-perpetuating thing that we may be talking about monarchy here. And that's something that is just completely not on the radar of most people. But if this third Rome is going to take place, it's going to require autocracy and something and someone in a civilizational order to push back against what is global satanic degeneracy coming out of this place that everybody thinks used to fight for good and fight humanitarian wars and fight for the little guy. That would be the US. I would call it the Yankee Empire, but it's this very Western mindset. How can people kind of crack the veneer of that? They understand what globo homo is. They understand the evil threat of globalism, but they can't admit that maybe they're rooting for the wrong team, because Americans are also very much team players. It's the good guys and the bad guys. They can't see nuance either. How can people come to understand that the big threat that is globo homo?
I can briefly answer that. I think in many ways it's the same reason that drives a lot of people in the West to convert to Orthodoxy to begin with, in the sense that you whether it's you start to take your religion more seriously. So you say, I'm going to investigate this to its fullest extent. I'm going to ask a question and then steelman the arguments, look into the history. And of course, that's not to say that everybody who converts to Orthodoxy or has a strong relationship with Christ in any kind of Christian tradition needs to be some kind of Sherlock Holmes and historian, but many people have found that a fairly cursory investigation of church history brings you to a radically different Christian tradition than one that is in any way ascendant in the United States today. And by that same token, if you apply that same kind of investigation to just both politics, history, and then just kind of epistemology in general, you're forced to kind of come to the realization that historic enemies of Christianity are ascendant entirely, and that's nowhere clearer than Zionism and its sort of ascendancy in the American and Anglosphere, post-war Anglosphere in general. But once you sort of come to that realization, it doesn't, and many people are like, oh, so now you just hate America. No, it doesn't have anything to do, even outside of obviously I'm a supporter of the Confederacy and have a heritage there, being from the South and everything. But even outside of that obvious paradigm struggle, there's nothing that makes you anti-American to be against this horrible empire, in the sense that there's no connection between the nation, the ethnos of the American people, and this kind of parasitic class. And that's even, you can talk about whether or not these people come from, certain parts of Eastern Europe that, may or may not have gotten expelled by czars and whatnot in the past. If it's those people or not, it's still this very small class of people in general that have very much brainwashed entire people into manufacturing their consent. And you can see that whether it's a form of Protestantism that's manipulatable towards Zionism, whether it's a form of then that same Protestant ethos forming a very kind of specific form of shareholder, semi-democratic capitalism that just leads to this horrible amalgamation of anarcho-tyranny that we see today in the States. All of those sorts of things are just the antithesis of what many people describe now as the Ancien regime. And thankfully, the French Revolution, I think, was so terrible that a lot of people, at least when I was in middle, elementary, and high school, I wasn't taught that the French revolutionaries were like 100% the good guys. And what that, that's between that and then the American Revolution, and then what ultimately started with the British Revolution and, the decapitation of Charles II and the ascendancy of people like Oliver Cromwell. Like, the Ancien regime, for better or for worse, was a sort of Christian civilizational ascendancy across like the entirety of Christendom that existed at the time. And whether you call it the Enlightenment, whether you want to call it the Great, of course, we source it back to the Great Schism in many ways, and that split in Christendom. But the Ancien regime is what started, and what ultimately, when we saw the world wars, that was the actualization of the fall of the Ancien regime, and the new regime was established and put into power. And what happened right at the beginning of those world wars was, of course, the assassination of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, which, again, we believe now, monks at Mount Athos, they put Putin in the bishop's emperor's chair when he goes and visits and whatnot, because they're prayerful and hopeful. But many people would argue that in 1917, 1918, the end times started. Whether how broad you want to get with the end times, of course, we know the end times technically started, with the death and resurrection of Christ. But people think that moment itself was truly because up until that point, there had been somebody claiming the title of Christian Caesar, Christian Czar, Christian Emperor. And when that stopped, when he died, that was a big, even Americans at the time, American Protestants had enough of a Christian civilizational consciousness to where a lot of them recognized that was a big deal. There's articles at the time of, wow, they just killed the Czar, like did not think they would, even if they were in favor of the constitutional liberal reforms going on in Russia, no, everybody was a bit shocked by that. And that proves how far we've fallen to this point where even suggesting these sorts of ideas that maybe if God does show us the right person, we should install them as an autocrat. Or maybe if, this, that, or the other happens, there should be state religion, or these kinds of ideas. People don't want to debate the merits of it. It's just presupposed that like now you're the bad guy for bringing this up.
Absolutely. Dmitry, anything you want to add?
Only that I don't fault people in the West. Myself, for many years, I've lived in the West, and even as I said, growing up, it is a struggle to understand how can autocratic. In the West, we even have this term absolute monarchy, which was really scary, and that appears in the French literature and British literature, and it's very Western, in fact. But in the Orthodox countries, the word absolute never really came around. We always called our monarchs autocratic. and in Russian it's samoderzhavny, but in the Byzantine Empire they called them autocrats as well, Basileus, or it was Dominatus system that set up after Augustus and Diocletian. Not getting into terms too much, but it was the monarch was very powerful. Essentially, there are no checks and balances except his good Christian conscience, his confessor, so spiritual father, which sounds really epic, and church tradition and the church itself. So, essentially, which sounds really, I mean, there's a pretty good checks and balances. I mean, those are checks and balances in my life too, frankly. And you can say in any family person's life, the man is the head of the household, right? As it is in Christian tradition. But what are the checks and balances over the man? Is certainly probably, I mean, you can say sometimes it is the wife, and sometimes it is the fact that he needs to look after the children. But what stops the man from abusing all the power he has? Is it the law? Is it civil, criminal? No, it's probably his adherence to some sort of code of morality and ethics through which he was raised, disciplined. And of course, if those ethics and morality, if that comes from a Christian backing, and if he actually lives in the Christian, lives a Christian lifestyle, and that's essentially what that brings great benefit to the entire family unit and even extended family, things like that. Society flourishes, and we see the same in monarchs. And again, one last thing about in terms of like monarchs being scary and things like that, it does need to be addressed, this particular query, because essentially for Western audiences, like, how do you understand that? And it isn't even on a top 10 priority list, frankly, in terms of living an Orthodox life. Maybe for Russians, it's moved forward slightly, but for people in a country which is still rising up in Orthodoxy and still learning in terms of like actually obtaining a large Orthodox population, like America, like in the West, and even in the Middle East, frankly, where Orthodoxy is a minority, Orthodox monarchy really is maybe like 0.35 on the list, right? And doesn't mean it's not still there. It is, but it's like, okay, let's build a monastery in our local community first before we think about raising up Donald Trump and crowning him and anointing him. It's simply there, but it's to put on hold. But one thing I wanted to mention was the fact that priests in the church, this is how, if you're undergoing catechism, if you're an inquirer, you're already noticing these small things. But notice priests in the church stand in for the bishop on one hand, because they are presbyters. They're not even in the Byzantine Empire back in the early years of Christianity. Only bishops could actually confess people. So they would come every 3 to 4 months to confess large groups of people. They would have even collective confessions and all this really cool stuff. These days, we're lucky enough to have these priests who fulfill the wishes of bishops and are blessed to hear our sins and to actually grant us absolution, which is really cool, because we have you have a priest in your local neighborhood or your local city, and it's really easy. And the point is, in a system of Christianity in which we live and to which we adhere, you can have people standing in for others. Priests stand for bishops. Bishops essentially are apostolic, and the apostles were standing in for Christ once Christ ascended to heaven. So Christ left them here on earth to translate his faith, to evangelize. He gave them this mission. But priests, more importantly, are also, I mean, we see them as Christ during the liturgy. They are fulfilling that Christly role of priesthood, and it's Melchizedekian. If we want to get into Old Testament terms, Melchizedek was this interesting prophetic figure that blessed Abraham in the Old Testament, and he was both a king and a priest at the same time. And we mention his name, I believe it's once every liturgy. Melchizedek is a priest and a king, so is Christ, a high priest of Jerusalem and Israel, and a king of Israel. So he's two things at the same time. So does that mean all priests are trying to take Christ's clout, so to speak? It's like, no. The priest is simply imitating him in a virtuous fashion. Christ gives them that authority to be priest alongside him, to follow along in his priesthood. And same as we're anointed by Christ, the word of Christ itself, it means anointed too. Like, what are we all pretending to be, Christ-like? It's like, yes, in a way, we're following along with him. We're not trying to say, in many ways, we are bound to inherit, Christ's grace and glory, by participation, and that's theosis as well. So it's all in this one concept. If you look at it holistically, it does begin to make sense somewhat. That kings, they're not just like trying to steal Christ's kingship; they're participating in it through a special role, which is only delegated to, it seems, people who Christ selected. Similar to how he chose Saul in the Old Testament, and then of course Saul, through his sins and inobedience, God decided through Samuel to anoint a second monarch, King David. And of course, the prophetic King David then led a line which led all the way to Christ, and Saul's line did not. So very interesting there. But, I think that's where people should look at it in this sort of fashion. And then perhaps it will begin to make sense, although, it may take a while. So it's not really a race or anything. It's just about personally understanding it.
Yeah, at the Ludwell Orthodox Fellowship Conference, which took place in September, some monarchists were there. I have a feeling that a lot of monarchists were there, but there was no talk of that per se, because there's so many other things to do to evangelize and do mission works here in the Bible Belt. So it's like that's something that is a topic that needs to be explored. But on one hand, it's like it makes complete sense, but we're also kind of a million miles away from that. So on one hand, like, clown world makes people very stubborn because they're just used to their habits, and it's a very bitter pill when they start realizing that the things that they believe in have been just a huge hoax. But on the other hand, it makes people seek out information because people know, whether they admit it verbally or not, that something strange is afoot. Things are not going well, and even though we're supposed to be free in America and have these elections, we all have a say, that's really not what's happening. So clown world, I try to look at the silver linings of it, because I might not even be an Orthodox Christian if the clown world and Protestantism hadn't pushed me in this direction. So it's kind of like strike while the iron's hot, but don't give people too much information. Not information, but bite off more than you can chew, maybe, I guess, is a way to put it. Do y'all feel that do you ever get a resistance where people are like, whoa, it's too much, slow down, that kind of thing?
Yeah, you never want to see someone walk into your parish for the first time and be like, what's up, bro? Like, and then just start dissecting their geopolitical opinions or anything like that. Obviously, you have to. That being said, though, I think, in many ways, I think priests and parish communities, they talk to somebody, they kind of figure out where they're coming from. And a lot of people are coming at it from our kind of perspective. And then, I'm not going to get into too much of my personal parish community, but, me and some friends of mine, we're kind of people that if someone comes in from this perspective, they're sort of directed our way. And then we talk to them as well, because some people, they have those perspectives, but they themselves are being humble and being meek and not wanting to impose their positions. And the next thing you know, they're in the church for 2 years and don't realize that there's a bunch of other people that also have those perspectives that were also just, no one's sitting in the liturgy like, where's the emperor? Like, no one's shouting out nonsense or making this somebody's big deal. But I mean, I frequent monasteries. I go to this monastery near me founded by Elder Ephraim, and you talk to the monks there, and the monks there will openly say yeah, I met a man who they not just met, I know people that have seen the marble king John Vatatzis, under Constantinople, and we all think he's coming back. That's kind of this. These are perspectives that people, if you go to places steeped in Orthodox tradition, even in America, these are going to be things you're going to hear about. So I think at the very least it's interesting. I think that there's a small minority of people that hear these things and just get very offended that anyone talks about them at all. But I think even people that they may consider themselves a run-of-the-mill Republican American voter, I think a lot of times if they're serious about Orthodoxy, they're at least interested in the ideas and see symbolic value in discussing just what it means to have a king or a monarch, at least in a symbolic sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else on that, Dmitry?
I think Conrad's completely right, and I agree with you, Dissident Mama, that look, there are steps to it, right? And even Russians themselves. So you look at countries which essentially post the 2014, you're like, wow, everyone's saying Russia is rising, but even Russia's a little bit of a long way away from essentially restoring what it had pre 1917. So it's going to take a while, I'll give you examples. So we speak about Orthodox monarchies, right, around the world. Let's not just say emperorship, or even we have a full-on monarchy where it's an official anointing and it's third Rome status. But even smaller Orthodox monarchies, look at Bulgaria, Greece, Georgia. I'm not even going to mention Georgia, but let's say Greece and Bulgaria, for example. Why don't they have Orthodox kings and 95% Orthodox? America wishes it was 95%. If America was 95% Orthodox, we would be living in the golden age, essentially, of unipolarity right now. Can you imagine if it was even nominally 95%? We would have culture would be very different around the world. There wouldn't be any discussion of Netanyahu. The Middle Eastern politics would be very different. Even if it was corrupt to a certain degree, just having that cultural backing of 95%, which in Greece and Bulgaria, that's what they have. And yet still their countries are dominated by this bizarre disease of liberalism, which essentially forces itself upon the minds of the locals, and they begin believing that, look, monarchy isn't the way. And so I want to say, look, it's not just about Americans or Texans or people in the South who like aren't accepting monarchy. I would say the onus. How about we in the West receive an example from the majority Orthodox countries first, which is why we speak a lot about Russia and Russia needing to restore monarchy first in order to cause a chain reaction and actually influence other countries in a positive fashion, similar to how you can say historically the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, it inspired through its orthodoxy Russia at the time, and Prince Vladimir and Princess Olga, and basically showed them, look, this is the true faith of Christ. We can show you this is the true cross here. This is how you venerate. And they, through their I guess you could say, culture, and through the fact that they brought them to church, you can actually influence other countries as well. And in this way, we wouldn't say this is political influence of some sort, like spreading globo homo. It's more like being like, okay, this is this element of Christian culture which we can export to other countries, or at least not export, but at least show them, look, we have the system, it seems to be working, and it's very much in line with our theological tradition. And so I would say the onus is on those majority Orthodox countries in the first instance. So there's no pressure on people in the West and those who have converted, I would say recently, or who are second generation converts, to transform their societies into perfect monarchist models, because in fact, this is a global struggle. Every country, every community needs to take it upon itself, and take like everybody's running not different races. We're all walking towards Christ, but essentially in a worldly sense, the world is a different place. We had 5 patriarchs in the past. We have many more now. Every country has its own worldly contexts. Like the 2 priests who are in Pakistan are not thinking about setting up a king, an anointed king of Pakistan. They're not. But they both believe that like if they were asked genuinely, like, what do you believe is true? What's the perfect? And they would say, yeah, an Orthodox emir or an Orthodox sultan. Like they would just tell you straight up,
right?
Because those 2 Orthodox missionary priests in Pakistan, they have that Orthodox tradition to cite and reference. But again, it's those majority Orthodox countries which need to set an example. I think that's the point. So
yeah, and the destruction of history. I've been beating that drum for a long time. That when the Southern cultural genocide started, and this was before 2020, just when people were starting about taking down monuments, and before the love fest of 2020, I kept trying to explain to people, like, not just that they're going to come for Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson too, but that there's something so it's such an abomination to go after history, because it's going after your inheritance and who you are, where you came from. And so I think more people are waking up to that now. And it's the history of Orthodoxy that got me. So my husband was the first who found out about it. And I was like, oh, that's just something Greek people do. And he's like, well, gave me a couple books, and he's like, read about this. So, wow, it's the early church history. So that was something that I think quite a lot of people that opens the door for them. So I think history is a good way to crack open the door on monarchism or something like that. And also that this whole like liberal democracy thing, it's a modern concept. I mean, it's like a baby concept, but we've all been living in it. And one of you said like the 20th century was basically this insane psyop or whatever. So we just think in terms of the 20th century onward. So let's go ahead and talk about the 20th century, and now we are living in the 21st century. Okay, we had 2 world wars back then. People didn't really know they were going to be called world wars as you were living through them. But your premise is that the third world war is happening now, that we're actually living through it. It's just not being called that yet. So tell us, what a time to be alive. Tell us, when did it begin? What are the fronts? And talk about specifically the info wars too, because I think online social media presences gets a lot of grief, and I just happen to think it's a front in the war. So what do y'all think about World War now?
Well, yeah, the show is called World War Now, so we do believe it. But it's a great question. When did it start? That's hotly debated. I think there's a good case for when the Civil War in Syria started. That meant something. Obviously, you can just talk about 9/11. Of course, you mentioned that it's an info war, and Marshall McLuhan, one of my favorite thinkers, he said World War III is a guerrilla information war with no division between military and civilian participation. And he was, the most preeminent impression media studies. He invented media studies as a scholar in the 20th century. He's traditional Catholic. Maybe if he knew more, maybe if Orthodoxy was more present in North America at the time, he might have been interested. But as far as when it started, we really do stick to the words of Metropolitan Neophytos on a lot of this stuff, because for those that don't know, the week before the COVID lockdown stuff got really crazy, like before everyone in the world maybe even actually had heard the word COVID, right before that, Metropolitan Neophytos said, you're living in the last normal week of the world. And from here on, everything's going to get crazy and fear will reign. And then, of course, the lockdown started. And since then, we've had the war in Ukraine start, this war in Israel start, of course, all the crazy lockdown stuff around the world. We had, just that was right on the end of, like you said, the Summer of Love, the Floyd worship, and then all of the other there's just so much stuff that's gone on. You could even kind of tap in the Donald Trump, Charlottesville rise of the whole dissident right in America thing into all of that time frame. But Metropolitan Neophytos stated at the beginning of the Ukraine war, even we're in the 2.5 year of the Third World War, hinting that basically around 2019, 2020, the beginning of the end of Trump's first term, this thing was really getting taken off. And we know Trump, he killed Soleimani, which was a huge actual escalation in the Cold War with Iran. So there's all sorts of points and nodes that you can point to about when it will begin. But like Marshall McLuhan said, in many ways, all of the resistance to the post-war order could be described as a front in the Third World War. But as far as the fronts, I'll let Dmitry hop in on this as well. But obviously, Russia-Ukraine was where the show got started. That's where our bread and butter was really made. But outside of that, we kind of had some major zones being China, Taiwan, Serbia, Kosovo, the Caucasus, which we would include Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And then, of course, the Holy Land. We've been talking about the Holy Land all the time before any of the Hamas stuff happened on October 7th. So that's just one of those places that, like, that's kind of like this whole latest flare up with Israel really kind of proved everybody the point of the show is to be monitoring all these situations. So then the whisk goes off. We have a whole host of background and understanding and patterns that we've been following before anybody else cared. Then now that everybody cares, here's what's actually going on. And look, here's just a fantastic example. February 3rd, 2023, Metropolitan Neophytos is interviewed by a Russian Orthodox outlet. So interviewers in Russian, he's talking in Greek. Obviously, he's the Metropolitan of the Morphou Metropolia on Cyprus, near the border of occupied northern Cyprus. And he's explaining how, this interview is asking him about the wars and what's going on. And, what do you know from your saintly spiritual fathers, St. Paisios, St. Porphyrios, about this? And he's just asked him, he's like, are you worried about Israel and Persia? And he's like, oh, and he's like, well, you should be. And this was, February of this year. And, and that's talking about, we talked recently in our episodes about Elder Theodore of Crete. He died in 2016. He said that in the near future, Israel is going to try to hit Iran's nuclear capabilities. Of course, we have St. Joseph of Vatopedi. He passed away in 2009 or 2006. He talks about huge wars to come in Constantinople, in Turkey. And of course, that gets us to the big prophecies from St. Paisios, who talks about the war to come between Russia and Turkey, and how that the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be a part of that. And of course, that then gets us into the Jews wanting to rebuild the Third Temple and all of that. So without getting into any of that, I'll let Dmitry talk about the fronts in the Third World War a bit.
Yeah, I would also say, I think it's around that time when Soleimani was assassinated. Also, the onset of COVID, I think, also broke the mold on, and essentially a lot of these countries, they were in this cocoon-like status where they were frozen, even Russia to a large extent, where it didn't react to the 2014 Ukrainian civil war, which you can call it officially, and the Donbass rebellion. There was no official position on that. And of course, Crimea was taking things like that, but we wouldn't call 2014 the beginning of World War III. In many ways, it's a precursor of sorts, on that particular Eastern European front. But yeah, naturally, things seem to have really escalated after Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphou in early 2020, like right before COVID really hit a global scale. He said, the world will be different. And naturally, throughout his interviews over the last 3 years, his message really hasn't changed. And so it is, we do see a very different world post-COVID. And regardless of if COVID was real or if it was a psyop, it doesn't really matter necessarily, because the elites have certainly used it in order to push the world in a certain angle as the cultists of the Antichrist that they are. They wish to bring their Moshiach back. And so they're trying to push the particular agenda in a certain direction. And naturally, we spoke about unipolarity and how they control the culture around the world to a very large extent. And so definitely the world moves along with their plans quite steadily, because the world, definitely is, sort of existing against the laws of Christ right now. Nobody really follows Christ's commandments as well as they should on a worldwide scale. So, of course, everybody goes along with what they have to say. But naturally, the fronts, right? The greatest front, I think, to come is probably that in Asia. China is building a huge sea wall of defensive fortification, because China historically, it remembers what the British did, it remembers what the German Navy did. All these threats from abroad always come from the sea. And so China is building a gigantic Great Wall of China along the South China Sea, essentially sea line fortifications, bases, anti-air missiles which can shoot hundreds of kilometers, and shoot planes which are flying like literally states away. Like someone's in Arizona and the anti-air missile could shoot from like Texas and hit them, and they see them on their radars. They're building these defensive fortifications for something, for a purpose. Countries like Kazakhstan, they're preparing anti-nuclear bunkers in the middle of Central Asia, like preparing basements. We hear these news from around the world. Naturally, these align perfectly with some of the prophecies of the saints, not just modern saints and elders like Metropolitan Neophytos, but also saints who have passed away in Ukraine, like we mentioned Saint Lawrence of Chernigov, say Elder Zosima of Donbass, Saint Seraphim of Viritsa. These saints from Western Ukraine prophesied about a conflict in Eastern Europe, but they also said a great world war is coming. There are at least, from what I can gather at this point, there are at least 20 saints who have spoken about World War III. So it's quite a large, pretty scary too. And frankly, look, if we look at the world generally as it is now, and we look at, say, World War II and how destructive it was, usually what is the precursor to wars? It's usually a huge cultural degradation. It's not good times which lead to wars, it's degeneracy. It's wars in many ways, just like in the Old Testament, they're God's way of waking people up to the absolute, bizarre behavior that's being exuded. And so just like the Soviets with their absolute degeneracy, abortion, ridiculous sexual ethics, persecution of Christianity in the 20s and 30s, essentially angered God to the point where he allowed World War II to take place, and so many Soviet Russians, of course, passed away. And it was a big challenge for the Russian people. Russia had to wake up and essentially begin to rebuild some of its churches, things like that, Orthodox communities. So will this world. Now we see the absolute degeneracy happening globally. And not to spend too long on this question, because I think a lot of your listeners probably already know this, but let's just move more to the fronts, right? So in North Africa, we see this huge issue of post-colonialism. So you had the French Empire, the British Empire, essentially still holding on to a lot of these countries, having influence over them. We spoke about like Niger and Nigeria. You probably heard these terms, speaking to the listeners, but you probably heard these news from Africa, like bizarre, like, hey, what are French people still doing in Africa? It's like, hey, what are the British doing? Why do the British control Nigeria and why do the French control Niger? Well, it's this post-colonial order where you have essentially this artificial post-colonial imperial control still dominant over these African countries. These African countries are not free. And now that they're actually obtaining independence, some of them through an Islamic route, some of them through a more nationalistic, you can say almost fascistic type, they're trying to come back into independence. You have local conflicts which are flaring up all around the world. And naturally, as we mentioned, as unipolarity falls, the world, it doesn't just naturally, it doesn't just give birth to multipolarity in an organic sense. No, I think we're probably going to see cracks occur, and there's probably going to be similar to how geologists tell us the world, being the globe that it is, has tectonic plates which clash against one another, and they cause conflicts in mountains, and sometimes in a very physical sense, like we saw in Turkey and Syria, right? The gigantic earthquake, which unfortunately took away thousands of lives, very horrific. But the world is in a state of preparation for a certain conflict. The saints tell us this, and we also see this culturally and geographically, politically. There are so many contradictions in various points. South America, they're just countries which it's kind of like a family feud. Like, you know, the whole year you don't speak to your family, and then one year like you invite everybody over for Christmas and everyone's at the dinner table, and then it takes a few drinks to get tongues loose, and then people just start speaking about things which they should have resolved prior to the feast day. But no, alas, it's you know, they're talking about their issues now, and you have all these countries, even the Middle East. Look at it now. It's like Israelis, Palestinians live with one another for tens of years, but they just couldn't. I mean, look, one country obviously has the responsibility here of actually resolving issues, but they haven't resolved them, and so it's turned into what we saw on the 7th of October, and this is repeated again and again in Ukraine, Russia, Taiwan, China, and these contradictions. As soon as we see Russia and Ukraine try to resolve theirs, Israel, Palestine occurs, North Africa occurs. Now we see things occurring in South America. Everyone's looking at China and Taiwan. Let's not mention India and Pakistan, both nuclear nations, and both, you know, deeply historically, for some bizarre reasons, naturally religious reasons, don't like each other, right? Pakistanis and Indians, unfortunately, their animosity is almost as heated as that of Israelis and Palestinians. And it's like the only thing that would let that go off is the fact that everybody else is having a merry old time fighting one another. That's just unfortunately human nature. It's like, well, if there's a massive bar fight, I can join in, grab a chair or grab a glass and like hit someone as well. So it's like that's the chain reaction which we saw in World War I and II. And I think this is what we may see, just like Japan invaded China during World War II. Like, who prompted that? Well, because they saw the whole world is in a ruckus. And so frankly, there may be this domino effect. And unfortunately, I think it's not really, you know, nobody's really playing to avoid it at the moment. I mean, Putin's trying, but he has his own war to fight. There's diplomacy doesn't seem to be holding it all together.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing, the escalation.
Yeah. And speaking of contradictions, you know, people so many times believe diametrically opposed things, and it's very difficult to try to parse through where they're coming from. So, you know, Christian nationalism is often poo-pooed in America by Christians, you know, because they start, you know, talking about Jefferson saying, you know, a wall of separation and all this kind of stuff. And because they don't know the history of him writing the letter to the Danbury Baptists, and he was really hoping to secure religious liberty on a local level. He was talking about no federal intervention. And all of a sudden in the mid-20th century, I think it was Justice Hugo Black turns it around and makes it like there can be no, you know, prayer in school and all this kind of stuff. And I'm bringing that up because it's oftentimes the people who should be clued in as to, you know, connecting the dots and understanding that this is like a satanic force coming at us and that you need to pull together. You know, they're the ones who, you know, are the biggest Zionists of all, you know, so that really just blows my mind. Can y'all speak to the Western Zionist narrative and how it undergirds, you know, some of this craziness going on in the world? And it's often Christians that are cheering it on.
Well, I guess I'll just say, I mean, it's good you draw the connection between Christian nationalism and how it's always the most fervent Zionists in like the evangelical camp that also, for some, like, not always, there are a lot of Christian nationalists are also fervent Zionists, but like the ones that are like writing their think pieces against it are also like, no, we really got to stand up for Israel. You know, it's always this David French type characters. And the problem with all of that is that, for better or for worse, and I'm not saying this as some kind of representative of the Orthodox Church or anything, I'm saying this as my personal conclusive opinion, but there's no form of Zionism that is compatible with Christianity. Like, I'm sorry, but if you're a Christian Zionist, you're not actually a Christian, because if you believe that there's any kind of salvation for the Jews where it doesn't involve them accepting Jesus Christ and converting and getting baptized and participating in the sacraments of the church, then you're by definition not a Christian. You believe that there is a path to salvation outside of the church, outside of the sacraments, outside of Jesus Christ, and that is just completely antithetical. That's the Christian idea, right? I mean, it's how you are not just heterodox. It's a different sort of religion. It's this sort of idea. It's obviously a total. It's a psyop religion that was made by a powerful group of people that had amassed what you could say was a form of political and social capital underneath the surface of what was still a European Christian dominated society. And then they then co-opted the religion of the ascending faction of that civilization and society, which was Protestant America, which had already had its institutions broken down. You know, it was low church. It was, like you said, this nonsense about church and state was in the works to then eventually get interpreted by someone who was just overtly subversive. And next thing you know, you have what, for historic, like, we talked about St. John Chrysostom earlier. St. John Chrysostom says that a true Christian will never tire of the fight against the Jews. And if you have now then your religion that like I talked about before, that civilizational inheritance, if that has now been used to turn that fire and fervor towards, frankly, who are the historical enemies of the Christian church from day one, 1 Thessalonians 2, not to go all E. Michael Jones on everybody, but just read the Gospel of John, read Paul, and to then have that co-opted to then be a vehicle of militant Zion. It's a militant, anti-Christianity effectively. I mean, that's an eschatological delusion that's an eschatological level of like psychological delusion and of, I guess, deception that has been perpetrated on millions of people.
Dmitry?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's not. I don't think we should discard the fact that this idea has been hoisted upon the majority of American Protestant folks' minds that Israel needs to be protected for some eschatological benefit, when in fact it's strange to me, because in my eyes, Protestant folks, they seem to be very disconnected. On one hand, they're very worldly. On the other hand, they're very disconnected from ideas such as kingdom and having monarchs and all priesthood authority. And suddenly this country of Israel, it takes all of that and just replaces it. It's like, okay, well, we're not going to worry about kings and bishops and all that funny stuff, but Israel, this, the land, the actual physical land, the third temple. It's like, wait, didn't we just not care about temples and cathedrals like a little while ago? But now suddenly we have to help some Netanyahu fellow restore the third temple and some rabbis. It's like, again, it's not really serious, and nobody debates this in the open. And frankly, people like David French, I'd be very careful about, if you hear any Orthodox Christians defending Israel, see what kind of, like, again, I'm not claiming to be some authority, but I do have experience teaching children, not adults, but young people, things about the church. And what do kids do very effectively? They always ask questions. They ask like they're like, oh, why did King David do that? Or why did God do this? And they ask questions about particular church traditions, and you need to know the answers, or at least you need to provide, at least, you need to be able to research why things are, why your positions are on certain things. And so if you see Orthodox Christians supporting Israel uncritically, ask them, like, where is this in scripture? Where is this in the liturgical tradition? What saint mentioned this, by the way? Like, what saint, causes you to support Netanyahu so fervently? Is it just the fact that you support Israeli patriotism, similar to how, maybe saints have said you should pray for your country? Because I'm sure if you're a Christian Israeli living in Israel, it's completely fine. You should actually pray for Netanyahu. You should, absolutely. Just like, and just like Ukrainians should pray for Zelensky, because Netanyahu, like the Pharaoh in the Old Testament, he needs to be enlightened, because he's absolutely gone off the rails. So people should be praying for Netanyahu, and they should pray for the Israeli government not to send itself down into the Red Sea and to be drowned in whatever chaos is about to come forward. But I think, it's just that consideration of like, well, just double check what people are saying, because there's a lot of fake news out there, and there's a lot of people who claim to be Christian. And, I'm not speaking denominationally here, but just generally speaking, they claim we're Christian, we support Israel. It's like, what are you basing that on? If you're basing it on some Schofield Bible or some, pastor who, was born in 1960 and he had his own like garage church and things like that, and wasn't belonging to any official denomination, or, just double check your opinions. Don't necessarily follow what's in the media or what these people tell you on the internet about, say, Israeli supremacy, or the fact that Israel needs to exist in a worldly sense. I mean, as a country and a nation state, I think that needs to be looked at very critically.
Yeah, and the current world war and all the contradictions that occur within it, I take them as learning opportunities and teaching opportunities. It's not that I'm the smartest person around, but I've asked some questions and I've learned. I mean, this is, how humans evolve. We are lifelong learners. And, I think that it's just so interesting. Like the worse things get, we're supposed to be free, but, America is not a culture. It's a system, it's despotic democracy, weaponized legalism, and lifestyle values. Clark Carlton said it was Disney, something else. He listed three things. Basically, he was like Disney and sodomy. Oh, it was Disney, consumerism, and sodomy. And, even if people don't say those words, they know it because we're living through this. Everybody can see it with their eyeballs, and something is wrong. So this is going to lead to my next question. Identity and culture is important within Orthodoxy. We're talking about the culture of the Israelites and their fatherland and all these types of things, but then we're not supposed to think that way. We have to think diversity and multiculturalism are great. And if you say the word fatherland, gosh, or Richard Spencer or something, So I think it's really an opportunity for people to understand what's happening, but also for some really great things to come out of it. So if things collapse in, let's just say America, since that's where I live, decentralization is a good thing because we don't want to live under this horrible system that we're living on, and nobody's happy. So, secession could happen, localism, people really tapping into like a neo-tribalism. I think Turley has talked about that before, this neo-tribalism where localist ties of, it doesn't have to be race and religion, but it could be, but it also could be just like a regional thing. Do y'all see that being on the rise throughout the world? And what do you think are the possibilities of it happening in America? Would it just happen by default because things are going to fall apart? Or do you actually see like localist independent movements coming out of the chaos?
Well, it's definitely happening all over the world. And the thing is, I know it's kind of the difference between, we've debated like MAGA communist and people before, and we would say that we're glad that multipolarity is happening, but I think what the civilizational perspective is that's different from like this kind of mainstream, like semi-right-wing, like formerly left-wing, now right-wing populist type of people that are all about multipolarity. Not all multipolarity is good, okay? Yeah. Like a satanic, like tribal system could arise in like some region of India and like wreak havoc on and that would still be in line with the neo-tribal, neo-traditionalization of the world. That's not to say that it doesn't present opportunity, it doesn't kind of free us from what was before a totalizing system that existed to stifle like any form of traditional civilization, but we could lose out, to some other terrible, horrible tradition that takes over, like Islam. Like, I think that I'm not going to come on here and give an anti-Islam polemic, because right now we know if you're giving huge anti-Islamic polemics right now, you're just a neocon trying to get us to blow up like Palestinian children. But we don't want to live under Islamic rulers. We don't want the Islamic population of Russia to explode. We don't want countries that were Christian to be encroached upon by Islamic neighbors. Even Armenia, they're...
Are you there, Dmitry?
I'm not happy to see, but at the same time, in America specifically, like you said, it literally isn't a culture. And as someone who lives in America, someone who's had ancestors here for hundreds and hundreds of years before both sides of the family, before the Civil War, I've got OG Anglos on one side, and then, early 19th century Germans on the other side came to the Republic of Texas. People are like, oh, America isn't a culture. And then what the hell am I supposed to do? Because I don't speak German. I'm not British. I've been maybe more than I might have a benefit. I was raised in a British colony for 6 years of my life. So maybe I could absorb that nonsense and be a libtard. It seems what that means to be Anglo like that. But if you're going to unironically like look me in the face and tell me that like America in that regard of being a white person, like isn't a culture, then like, you just are, I'm not trying to say, I don't like saying this, but like, you want a genocide? Like, what is that? It's like cultural genocide. Like, what am I? What am I supposed to identify as in like an objective kind of sense? Sure, he's a Westerner, but he inherited a strong Russian tradition. Obviously, he's fluent in Russian. His family have memories, some members of his family, they were fleeing communism in Russia. There's a strong tradition there that, thankfully the West, in something like, especially in America, thankfully, as my it was one of those, and this is a God thing, as my tradition was basically revealed to not really be a tradition. It was, as the ethnic and cultural character of America disappeared, and it was, like I just said, revealed that I guess it isn't a culture at all. The church and cultural institutions that have been making that up then had, like, it becomes this kind of low church. It just becomes this thing that, unless it really personally applies to you in that kind of way, in that mediumistic way, it's not actually a part of who you are as an enculturated person. But thankfully, in America now, there's millions of Orthodox Christians and people that, like, literally because of communism and because we were in a Cold War against communists, Christians were then able to come here and be Christian here, and by the grace of the Holy Spirit, they were able to survive the cultural onslaught. And now we're seeing this right now. I mean, Elder Ephraim, he said that his monasteries that he built in America, 18 plus, will be refuges in the time of the Antichrist. And now it seems that we've reached that point. There's no longer huge waves of Orthodox Christian immigrants coming to America. Now it's time to batten down the hatches, and the people, the wheat is being separated from the chaff, and God has given us a good look. Sure, there's still work to be done. There's still places in America where you're far away from an Orthodox parish. But the fact that me here in suburban Austin, Texas, can drive 50 minutes to a ancient Greek Orthodox monastery with, that was founded by a saint, it's pretty, it's the way that God works in the world. I think all these arguments where people try to dissect history and metapolitics and how, no way could religion be important. There's just too much going on. How could somebody on the other side of the world hear about this religion? This is a stupid heuristic. I just don't buy that. I just don't think that's a good argument just from a objective perspective.
Dmitry?
Yeah, I think, look, I think having a religious moral compass, I think, is probably the most important thing. And naturally, Orthodox Christianity, and you could say generally Christianity provides that in a very strong sense, especially to us Westerners. It's essentially the foundation, the cornerstone of our culture anyway. So it shouldn't be that difficult to actually obtain those particular values or to bring them back, because at one point, all of us Westerners, all of us white Europeans, and now white Americans, our ancestors were all Orthodox Christians anyway. Like, genetically speaking, Europe was all Orthodox back in the day. And it wasn't not even that long ago. It was like, only, you can say 800, 1,000 years ago, when the entirety of Europe was Orthodox. And so, in fact, it's not really a bringing in of a foreign culture. It's more like just returning back to your roots. I think people should be liking that, especially given the fact that modern culture has definitely, as you mentioned, modernity, and the fact that we're, in this postmodern world, it's the fact that, look, we've kind of gone off the rails culturally speaking. Perhaps we need to wind back a little bit and just look at some examples in the past. Look, well, maybe we have gone wrong. Orthodoxy is just the most effective way of doing so. Like, you're reaching a point back in time where things were actually right, and you're thinking, look, we don't actually need to go any further back than this, perhaps. Like, let's not stress ourselves out and think about there are all kinds of people on Twitter, for example, who speak about weird things like paganism or like ancient BC times. We don't have to stress our minds out that much, okay? Like, it's getting a little bit LARPy and hypothetical here. We just have to think, return back to Orthodox Christian Europe, that sort of ideal. Naturally, America being a child of Europe, right? White American, the nation of America, the white American people are essentially the inheritors of European culture, so the inheritors of that particular Orthodox Christian culture anyway. So, and just regarding regionalism, I think, unfortunately, the American system, which was so powerful and so dominant, and if it was building up towards a certain crescendo, that crescendo was hijacked at some point in history. Probably, I think everybody would agree. At one point in the 20th century, bad people took over the American system. And so that particular system, it's hard to identify with it on maybe a federal level. Like, do you really identify with the Benjamin Franklin on the $100 bill as much as, even you begin even looking critically at the founding fathers, for example, because you just, and even though the founding fathers might have been great people back in the day, in fact, they were probably 100% more moral than any of the politicians we see to this day. Like, we would rather have them than any of these folks leading the country today, right? But regionalism, naturally, ideas like Texan successionism or secessionism, at least, these ideas that, look, if America falls apart, we need to look to our local communities first and foremost. I think that comes out of crisis. It's not that we want to do that. I think it's the fact that, well, we need to look, you need to cater to your own local community first and foremost, without betraying your nation. Don't be the reason. Don't be the one who, maybe slams the last nail into the coffin, or to like pushes the sick man over the if someone's standing on the edge of a cliff, don't be the one who pushes the person down. Don't commit the crime, but simply just be prepared. You're not a qualified doctor. It may not be up to you to heal this particular person. I mean, by God's grace, miracles do occur. Like we see them every day. America, in its state that it's in right now, possibly could get better, and that's why still voting and possibly supporting Christian politicians may still be on the cards. I don't want to be too pessimistic about this, but local communities matter, because if everything sort of hits the fan, and if things go south, no pun intended, there does need to be at least some ties to local communities which you can still support if the entire country, if the idea of an American nation, of the federal American state, it's called the United States of America, if this union breaks up, you need to have some sort of foundation. You don't just believe in mass media and what you see on Instagram. Like, that shouldn't be your compass. Your compass should be local first, and then of course expanded onto the office of the president and him being your particular leader, so forth and so on. In a good world, it would be someone like Donald Trump, but at the moment it's old man Joseph Biden. So it's a bit hard to identify with him as the leader of your country, but I think that's where it needs to start, local first, and moving on from there.
Well, real quick, like in countries like, in America, we're seeing like Greater Idaho and things like this, that I think, if the federal government allows things like that to happen, I'd be interested to see how the political technology works out. But in general, at this point, unfortunately, I don't see like the infrastructure existing for like American secession or anything. I support people moving to more conservative states, those sort of things may eventually, we may get something like that happening. But as far as like where this kind of retribalization, this neo-tribalism is going to matter, Dmitry, you said you didn't want to mention Georgia earlier, but, unfortunately, they're kind of a NATO base. But outside of that, 80% of Georgia supports a return to a monarchy. They're seeing their terrible birth rate, recover, as Patriarch Ilya, baptizes, thousands of children every year if they're the third child of like a Georgian family. And again, like if a small, like Dmitry said earlier, it's these smaller Orthodox countries where the onus as far as like the monarchy question is on them. But as some of these places start to, as unipolarity falls, and if America has to prioritize itself where it can't just busy itself with throwing so many gay pride parades in Tbilisi, then eventually some of these places will have, there will be a country of 2.5 million people that has like an Orthodox constitutional monarchy. Maybe in 40 years, Russia will have some kind of restructuring of its political system. But in America at this point, it's just there's still, just like we said, there are certain areas I think that can really start to kind of think about themselves in a maybe kind of for a future plan for when if something bad happens, it can be there. But people need to just still be just doing the work, like in there from an epistemological and cultural perspective, to even create the institutions where people who kind of start to think this way can then find a place at all.
Yeah, and I see it as like a personal secession, as like a spiritual thing, as opposed to like strictly political. So I'm going to read you all a quick quote from one of my favorite historians, Dr. Clyde Wilson. He says, "The South, many believe, still has a substantial authentic culture, both high and folk, and it still has a purchase on Christianity. That is, the South is a civilizational reality in a sense, which the United States is not, and it will last longer than the American empire." So this is one of the things that when I helped co-found the Ludwell Orthodox Fellowship, this is what I'm thinking about, whether or not, the Yankee Empire goes on in perpetuity for 500 years. I don't know. That's all beyond my pay grade. But it is preparing in body and soul now for what can come, and tapping into the heritage and the roots that are here. And I think that's one reason we are so hated, the fellowship per se, but that's why Russia is hated too, because they may have been latent for a long time, under attack and latent and digging themselves out of a hole. But that's how I see us all doing that on an individual basis as sinners, but also just living in modern times. I mean, we're all constantly digging ourselves out of a hole. So I actually make a comparison between the South and Russia, because I see a lot of their struggles in past history as not synonymous, but similar enough that I think that's why Russia and Putin is so hated, and the South is, and that's why Robert E. Lee just got all melted down and stuff. So, to me, wheat and chaff moments, right? And I see increased persecution as clarity. So whenever people are freaking out to me and, oh, this is going crazy, I'm just like, I think despite the suffering, well, suffering can be good, obviously, from a Christian perspective in the death, but these are moments where it's so much easier to see that the emperor has on no clothes and who thinks he has on clothes and who doesn't. So I'll wrap it up by having y'all explain, what you think some of these wheat and chaff moments are, separating the sheep from the goats, and how you think that we can prepare in body and soul. Because I think this is a quote from you, Conrad. Ultimately, we are already seeing this. Every country will be forced to reckon with their place in this new multipolar world and decide how they will deal with the shortages and political turmoil. So tell us what y'all think about that. How should we prepare in body and soul?
Well, I like what you said about the South and everything. I think the destruction of the South and the Civil War, we talked about the destruction of the Anshin regimes. That was happening in America, was the destruction of the old aristocracy of the South. And look, whatever you think of, I'm not even going to talk about slavery, but that was a system that led to a lot less chaos than things we see like happens in 2020. And if it had been allowed to dissolve in a different way, we may have seen a lot less different problems. That aside, as far as these wheat and chaff flashpoints go, I mean, like I say, at a certain level, Metropolitan Neophytos talks about how St. Porphyrios told him that his voice will be heard from Canada to Australia, from America to Japan, all over the world. And this is in like the early 90s. He had no idea what that meant, but St. Porphyrios said like the technology of the time will help you do that. And at this point, if you're a Christian, and when it comes to some of these issues like Zionism, or when it comes to some of these issues like Russia, Ukraine, I know that the media is satanic and evil, but for better or for worse, we live in a system where almost nobody in the West is avoiding some kind of news, media information from a screen, whether it's you're holding in your phone, or you're on the computer, or you're watching TV, or you walk down the street and see it on a billboard on some city. At a certain level, whether it's like you said, the persecution of priests in Ukraine or the bombing of churches in Israel, if you are clinging to just these kind of hyper worldly ideas, something like Zionism, or something like like I still see this giant Ukraine flag on this Honda dealership I drive by on my way to church. I'm not saying that your political opinions are what help you in these times of crisis, but if you are genuinely just like so caught up in those kinds of things, where then you just can't recognize that I'm a Christian and these sorts of things matter, if you've been so deracinated from that reality, then maybe, I guess that'll be a moment where you're going to fall on the wrong side, or maybe, or in a more, I don't know, you could say it's hopeful, you could say it's terrifying. God is going to, kind of have to shake the cage a little bit. So then those people, the paradigm totally shifts, whether that's extreme adversity or some kind of crazy event or some kind of spiritual movement, a religious reawakening. I don't know. Again, that's well above my pay grade. I'm not Nostradamus. I don't claim to actually know what's about to happen in the immediate future, but just that total paradigm shifting reality, whether it's like an earthquake in Turkey, killing hundreds of thousands of people, or some kind of political even like something like Donald Trump. People talk about how Donald Trump could be the biblical Antichrist. Yeah. And that's a lot more of a interesting, believable idea than the fact that the Antichrist is going to be some Hasidim with ringlets and a hat in the Holy Land named Shlomo. Like that seems a little too obvious. Whereas something like a actually right-wing ascendant figure trying to bring back this kind of mid-20th century American ideology, I could see that being something that could at least precede something akin to an Antichrist that people would actually fall for, that somebody like me could actually fall for. Because look, if I couldn't fall for it, then it's not the Antichrist, because I'm not a saint. So like there's like if it's not like a little bit interesting and intriguing to me, then it's not a particularly well thought out deception.
Yeah. Dmitry?
Well, at least now that we've pushed away the idea that Shlomo is the second coming of Christ, and he has nothing to do with the Messiah. That's good, because there is a new Mashiach in the Holy Land, allegedly. So the Israelis are trying to find themselves, a new high priest and a new king. But naturally, this happens every century or so. But I think most importantly, firstly, Dissident Mama, your question had two layers. It was like there was a personal layer, and that was like a collective, well, what are like civilization, or what are big collective red flags? And I guess firstly I'll mention my red flag. So this is what I look for. This is what I avoid. If people are pushing these ideas, I am automatically it gives me the ick, so to speak. In a very modern TikTok-like sense. If one, so philo-Semitism, I think I'll call it that. So this exceptional love for this obsession with, those folks, that's very strange, and that's very questionable automatically. So automatically that sets off a red flag. I'm not going to go into all of these examples. Two, liberalism. Back in the day, the main vehicle of liberalism was, of course, not just Western culture, unfortunately, was hijacked by this, and Protestant Western culture in many capacities, but also Catholic culture, but Freemasonry on a secret society level. Freemasonry these days seems redundant. Why? Because their job is done. They've already spread this particular Enlightenment type of culture all around the world. So although secret societies in general are very toxic and should be, completely removed from a very healthy society, they shouldn't exist. But naturally, liberalism is number two. That's my red flag. If somebody's obsessed with liberalism, wants to expand upon it, and this goes into like liberal human rights as well, like very bizarre readings of how human rights should even interact in international law. Just claiming a country needs to be more liberal, it's already like, okay, what are we talking about here, buddy? Yeah. And three, I would say communism, because it's a kind of a specter of the past, and thank God it has passed away, and it's just it's a rotting corpse. But still, it can infect and distract a lot of people, especially young men, for this example, because it is a very distracting force. And I would say even a lot of folks in third world countries, the global south, we see it today, right, Conrad, on Twitter, in other places. People from countries which aren't under Western unipolar hegemony tend to follow this particular, they're like, oh, what's an alternative to Western domination? What's an alternative to the alphabet community's parade down my street? Oh, maybe it's Karl Marx. It's like, no. It isn't Mordecai or whatever his name is, right? It isn't him, and it isn't his philosophy and his political theory either. So those are my three main red flags. These are the three things that probably should be avoided. And naturally, there are a lot more than that, but I think in the modern context, these three things are very, very dangerous. And naturally, liberalism, you can have what falls under liberalism. You can have feminism, things of this nature, like feminism, the abortion debate, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of builds onto itself. But in terms of local, what effect do we individuals and local communities and families have? Well, Christ told us that we're the leaven, we are the salt of the earth. Our prayers and the way we live our lives, our piety directly impacts the communities around us. Saint Seraphim of Sarov said the same thing. He said, obtain the Holy Spirit and thousands will be saved around you. So it's all paraphrasing the same idea. Mm-hmm. And Professor Alexei Osipov, who has over 800,000 subscribers on YouTube, he's a famous Russian Orthodox seminary professor. He taught many future priests, bishops in Russia. He's still alive. He's like 89 or like 95 or something. He's really old. Just last week, he said, look, we Christians have a direct impact and burden upon ourselves to live pious lives because it directly impacts those around us. The reason why countries like America is still standing is because of the pious Orthodox Christians like yourselves. You live in this community, in this country, and you pray and you try to stick to the laws of the church and following the commandments of Christ, and this goes a long way. So we are the leaven of the, it's a burden. It's not really proclaiming that, oh, we're so special. It's like we're special because we took upon ourselves this burden, and following Christ, it's a cross. But as long as we carry that cross, society around us will, to some degree, even materially flourish. I think that's important to keep in mind. So that's probably my very brief answer, I would say.
And, I've touched on this a bit, but these crazy times we live in do give us opportunities to talk about things that even a year ago, nobody wanted to talk about Palestine, Israel, because it's super taboo and whatever. And now, everybody's just kind of letting the freak flag fly, and it can get real scary sometimes, but these are all conversations that need to happen. And, things like, it's the Holocaust industry. Paul Gottfried is a person who talks about that. He happens to be an ethnic Jew. The whole slavery thing, when we're talking about the South, but this whole thing where, you create a monopoly on suffering and only some people are allowed to suffer. Well, with these crazy times we're experiencing, suffering is going to happen, and how we use that to come closer to Christ is going to be, I think, the preeminent thing happening. And I'll end it with this, and then y'all can give your final thoughts. I think it was you, Dmitry, in one of your most recent podcasts said, chaos was fostering Orthodox unity. Sometimes when you're in the trenches in the orthosphere, you feel like there's not much Orthodox unity, but I think you are right. One other thing too about suffering is the Rocor Diocese of Eastern America. I was told recently that when they're naming new missions in the South, in the Eastern Seaboard, over almost to Texas, they're all going to be named after new martyrs because of the persecution that is already happening of Orthodox in America and the increased part of that. So just any last thoughts as far as how nobody has a monopoly on suffering and how the chaos will foster unity and, God willing, more people coming to the church, since that is the hospital we all need.
Well, I think it's important for people to remember that there's never going to be some kind of like institutional recognition by the powers that be of like Christian persecution or suffering. So as far as, actual, like you're always going to be called a denier or whatever it is if you try to actually assert the truth, which is that this world is coming after Christians, and not just Christians. I think the obvious nature of part of World War now is the fact, this is just the obvious fact that so many of these hot zones are just directly in extremely Orthodox parts of the world, and that's not a coincidence at all. And the fact that our bishops, more than any other, even the Catholics, the Catholics are close because they've got all those uniates in Palestine and everything, but when a church gets blown up in these areas, it's an Orthodox church. When the priest gets arrested in Ukraine, it's a canonical Orthodox priest. So that should frankly be a sign to a lot of people, by your fruits they will know them. Well, they hated you because they hated me first, as Christ said. Well, who does the world hate the most? It seems to hate the canonical Orthodox Church the most. And
when America drops bombs, it's in Orthodox countries on Orthodox people.
No one even cared about, 9/11 happened, and then everyone cared about the Iraqis. No one cared about the Serbs or anything like that, despite the fact they didn't even do a 9/11 for that. So the kind of the lack of kind of comparison, it shows that even the fact that Serbs they're also white, so that really doesn't help with the oppression Olympics. They're at the bottom of the list. And we see how, just when you relearn American history, whether it's gaining a sympathy for the Confederacy, whether it's gaining a sympathy for the Germans that were displaced, the millions and millions that were killed on the continent by Eisenhower or in the aftermath of World War I, whether it's people gaining a new understanding of the Cold War situation in South America, which proves that basically we were, we basically neutered the anti-communist forces there to be neoliberal, to now there's no genuine right-wing resistance at all to communism in South America at all. Once you understand all of these things, then you can start to finally accept that, well, here in America, we're witnessing a white genocide in America and Europe, and then around the world, at that very same empire that is replacing its own people at home is then genociding Christians around the world. Of course, we talk about what can only be described as a genocide of Christians from the Holy Land ever since the Nakba and the beginning of the Zionist entity's existence in the region. And then, of course, this attack on the Serbs, and then just the Cold War in the 90s was just a rape of Russia by global capital. In all of these actions, it's pretty obvious who is the true enemy of them boys and of their ultimate master, the devil.
Dmitry, can you follow that up?
Yeah, it's also it's an exploitation of empathy on a large global scale. You're asked to care about certain things around the world, care about, and I mean this in the most negative sense, care about the oppressed women, care about the alphabet community, care about African-American descendants of slaves. Let's talk about reparations. It's all a massive distraction. And frankly, what we should care about is firstly ourselves, in terms of our sinful selves taking us to church, going to confession. You should look out for, actually attending confession, because that's who you have direct influence over, is yourself, right? Is actually fixing your own problems. You're the sickest person that you know. And so you're the one who actually needs all the assistance. And everybody needs to self-reflect a little bit more. And only then perhaps, and naturally it's a marathon, not a sprint. You can never be, it's like, oh, well, I've prayed for 40 years. I'm prepared now to speak on global issues. It's like, not really. There's never really an end point, right? It's more of a lifestyle. You have to go on and completely live for Christ, the earth. That's the challenges the worldly life brings to us. And so, but on a collective scale, you do see the powers of the world exploit empathy on a large scale, which is it's the Antichrist like fashion. Look at how, I mean, who knows what the Antichrist himself will bring, what kind of empathy about whom, who knows what the end times, eschatologically speaking, we'll see in the world. But we do see it's like, oh, look at the victims of said war, or this particular event, or this riot in Europe, or these particular people overseas. And maybe their plights are even real, but how the direction and even the outcome. So it's like, okay, well, surely we should pray for victims of said event, A, B, or C. But what are the outcomes? What lessons? What are they attaching to that empathy? And the attachment is, oh, well, so in order to avoid this thing, we should now follow through with our liberal world ideas because we know what the solution is. No. In fact, I think it's Christians who actually know what the solution is. And it's, well, we should be more Christian in order to avoid these tragedies in the future. And I think that's the message which is being avoided by as Conrad said, the people, the powers of the world, the people in control, the globalists, those who want to hoist upon us a new world order and even want to even exploit this multipolarity idea. Because again, we're speaking about people who have very, very high IQs, people who plan, as Jay Dyer said, decades in advance. They know it's like a massive chess game. They know, well, look, if we enter into multipolarity here, here's how we can exploit it. Here's how we can still win in the end. Here's how the third temple can still be built, even in this particular system. So we have to keep in mind, that there is this psychological collective game ongoing for the minds of not just Christians, but regular folks too, in terms of people not in the church yet. And naturally, it's a big distraction too. You mentioned new martyrs we can pray to because they're still living in church. And, it's not exactly their suffering, which we always speak about, but it's their witness of Christ, right? Yeah. It's their witnessing that they can, that's the power that the Christ gives you when you live with him. You can actually overcome all of the suffering and even death itself. And that's the main message. It isn't like, notice even Russian Christians, it's not even about crying about the fact that, millions, 20 million martyrs, 600,000 martyrs, or, it's not that particular factor. It's not the numerical. It's just the fact that, wow, how impressive that God could actually, so many people stuck to God's commandments and carried it out until the end. I think that's the impressive part. It's the Christianity in it, because they're still alive and all those people are amongst the angels in heaven. And I think that's the main message. Just don't let your empathy get exploited on, especially a media basis, because again, we're not telling everybody to be Luddite and turn off your phone. I mean, that could be very, very healthy and beneficial. It's not something I can do at the moment, unfortunately, but if don't let your empathy be exploited. If anything, direct it towards immediate, as Conrad mentioned, he quoted Konstantin Pobedonostov from our recent episode Behind the Paywall. Your empathy and love.
Hold up if we want to read it. I've got it right here.
All right. I mean,
I was going to literally bring it up. I mean, if people listen to our most recent Ether Hour episodes, our most recent one was about Konstantin Pobedonostov, who is a, Tsar, a monarchist, assistant, advisor to the Tsar, Alexander III and Nicholas II. And he was asked a question about the truth from Saint Maria of Paris when she was a child. And he says, the truth is in love, of course, but many people think that the truth lies in love for the distant. Love for something distant is not love. If everyone loved his neighbor, their real neighbor, who is really near him, then love for those who are distant would not be needed. It's the same in business. Distant and big things are not business at all, but the real things are close, small, unnoticeable. The feat is always unnoticed. The feat is not in pose, but in self-sacrifice and modesty. That's feat, F-E-A-T. And then, I mean, he's a thinker that undergirds a lot of our thinking. But then on your first question, kind of about this victimization narrative as well, our episode before that of Ether Hour, Dmitry recounts a fantastic story of a Father Methodius in the Holy Land who was tortured by both the Zionist IDF and the communists who were assisting them at the time. And of course, he passed away in the 90s and could be described ultimately as a confessor when, perhaps he will eventually get canonized. But no one talks about him. You've never heard of him. You had to hear. The only reason anyone's heard that story is because they listened to our little podcast, and Dmitry heard it from his father. So this idea that, that suddenly the Christian suffering will never be as relevant as the suffering of the ascendant, led by Jews and then reinforced by everybody besides white Christians.
Right. And I've heard Paul Gottfried, I mentioned him earlier, but he has invented a term, I'm pretty sure it's his, called surrogate atonement. And it's how you atone for something you're in no way responsible for in relation to someone who's in no way a victim. And you probably don't even know them to boot. I added on that last part. So, yeah. And I think this is a good way to end it, because I think Orthodox Christians aren't, we're not super virtue signaling people, because, I think virtue signaling is a product of guilt, and Orthodoxy doesn't have that. We're not obsessing about guilt all the time. And so I think the surrogate atonement and attaching things to empathy and altruism, that is very much an American character trait, but using it in the wrong way. So it's just a win-win. If more people can come to Orthodoxy, they won't virtue signal as much. Hey, they'll be in the true church. We'll start growing our missions and our parishes, and God willing, people will be nicer to each other. Just like, and who was the guy you just quoted? What's his last name?
Oh, it's a tough spelling. Pogodonoshtev. Yeah.
Yeah, listen, I got through about almost half of that episode, but I was like, I'm gonna get them to announce that. But yes, kindness, love, being kind to yourself, to your family, to your neighbors, and from there, it goes out. So, gentlemen, any last things you want to touch on? I could talk to y'all for 1,000 years, but I've already gone a half an hour over. So add anything that you want to touch on, and then we'll bid you adieu.
Dmitry, go ahead.
Look, I think it's really important for us living in the modern world, and your audience especially. So listeners, naturally, they're online. So it's really important to both, most of your listeners are probably Christian, but even those who aren't, I think it's important to just understand the modern world has a very, very powerful effect on the psyche, on the mind of humans. That's why we see so many mental illnesses and things which affect the mind very differently to maybe even 100 years ago. 100 years ago, people could pass away from plagues and physical illnesses. These days, it's not so much the physical, it's the mental, which is in conflict. So I think very much, stay healthy in that sense, everybody, and definitely, you can moderate that. You have the freedom and control over what you consume online. And this goes, this is speaking about very, things, viceful things, watching ridiculous films, watching, even listening, even music. All these things affect us differently. And I don't mean to preach in a certain sense, but it does go a long way because, I think in terms of news as well, the things that build up anxiety. So watching news from particular sources which simply want to perpetuate the idea that, well, everything's horrible and bad, Like funny enough, whenever that's why I don't like watching World War II, World War I movies, because there's never a portrayal of any Christianity in them. It's almost as if like Christianity didn't exist in those two periods, when in fact it did. We don't see any priests or anyone in the trenches of World War I, when an entire front line, the Eastern Front, had Orthodox military priests participating. And I wrote an entire article about that, which spoke about Orthodox participation in the different world wars. But nevertheless, I think it's just the media has this particular impact on our minds, and I think that shouldn't be neglected. We shouldn't downplay that. It's not just a conspiracy theory, it's reality. Your local priest probably already knows that. I'm speaking to the various Christians who attend church, but if you speak to your priest and you haven't before, definitely do. Like, speak to them about content moderation. Like, okay, what can I do to live a healthier life? Because it begins with, we need to, again, as Christians, we need to live pious lives. That usually comes in the form of families, and you can't be consuming junk on a personal, individual level. And that goes for news as well, frankly, which is why I like what me and Conrad do, because we can at least succinctly summarize certain world events without you needing to sift through a bunch of garbage in order to actually obtain, I guess, and I guess that's the service which we bring. Mm-hmm. I think that's the most important thing. I would say if we're selling a product, if we're providing a service, what are we doing? We are summarizing weekly news regarding geopolitics and the coming World War III, which essentially is we might be in the actual initial stages of it. Yep. So I think that's probably what we're all about.
And Conrad?
Well, as I said, both on my thread that started it in my first article and the first episode of World War Now, were they calling it World War II during the Anschluss? I don't think so. So here we are. And yeah, Dmitry summed up what we do really well. And I think in general, if you're wondering, like, call to action, obviously if you're not Orthodox, go to an Orthodox church, become Orthodox. But if you kind of have a hard time with any of the things we say, I would obviously I could just be wrong. There's always that possibility. I am just a person. But at the same time, if it's more of like you're offended or you have a hard time swallowing just these kind of extremely heterodox, and I mean heterodox to the orthodoxy of our time here in the West, start to assess what if you had a civilization that you consider yourself a part of, what is that civilization? And if it's more this modern fake nonsense, then maybe take a step back and imagine how you would think about things if you were a Christian civilizationist, if you came from a truly Christian civilization, if everything that you did, and this is like a big argument for why people become Orthodox at all, like instead of, posters, everything you'd seen was icons. If instead of going to brunch every Sunday, you went to liturgy, if instead of having to drive 30 minutes everywhere in your non-walkable city, you could walk to your local church, like how would you think about the world if that was the life that you lived in? And if more people started to do that, then I think Christians would have an easier time resisting the temptations of the world and seeing the truth and glory of the kingdom that God has given us in his church and in his creation. So I think that's the takeaway.
Yes, and we have been a bit critical of the media, but it's a tool, and I think y'all's advice is good. But thank God there are people like y'all out there being an aggregate for all the crazy stuff going on in the world, but funneling it through the lens of hope. I mean, every time I listen to y'all's podcast, I come away hopeful, and we all need more of that. And just thank y'all so much for what you do and for giving me so much of your time. I really appreciate it. And God bless you both in moving forward. And I hope you have not just 50 more episodes, but 5,000 more episodes. So hopefully y'all can pull that off since y'all are young. But thanks, gentlemen, so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.